In this lecture, we are going to return to the topic of risk. We will review very quickly what risk is. We will then discuss the four types of risk: legal, operational, reputation, and strategic. And we will conclude with a very brief discussion of the 3 lines model. You'll remember from an earlier lecture that we defined risk as the potential for harm, and the formula, which is very common throughout the risk management world, that you'll often see is risk equals threat times vulnerability. And again, we're using multiplication here, so if there is no threat is a 0, then there is no risk, because anything times 0 is 0. Similarly, for vulnerability, if there's no vulnerability, then that is a 0, and anything times 0 is 0. So no threat or no vulnerability means no risk. I understand this is all a bit abstract, but we are going to look at 2 concrete examples in just a moment. So if you're not quite following along, be patient for just another minute, and we're going to look at some examples that should help clarify this for you. Now, as risk management professionals, and that's a lot of what being a privacy professional is, we manage risk first by identifying the risk, and then second, implementing a control. And a control is a measure used to mitigate risk. And we'll see that there are different flavors of controls out there. The most common that we'll come across are administrative, technical, and physical. And we will return to those 3 flavors of controls soon. So let's look at a common everyday example that I think most of us are going to be able to relate to. And that is the risk that we assume when we get into a vehicle. This can be a vehicle that we own or we lease or we rent. We're getting ready to drive somewhere. Perhaps we are getting in the car as a passenger. This could be through a ride-sharing app. Or perhaps we're getting on the bus. This could even include, though less common, getting into a subway train. When we get into that vehicle, we're assuming a risk, and that risk is of bodily harm and, unfortunately, death. The threat that could materialize that risk would be a car accident. Again, let's just assume we're getting into a car here. And the vulnerability that would allow this risk to materialize would be the fragile human body. And so bodily harm or injury, this is our risk. The threat would be a car accident. For example, another car hits us, so that other car is the threat. And the vulnerability, again, would be our fragile bodies. So we've identified the risk of bodily harm, and there are a number of things that we do to control that risk. We know that there is a possibility we could get into a car accident, and so we do a number of things that are going to mitigate that risk, so that if we are in a car accident, hopefully we and our friends, our family, the other passengers in the vehicle, they are unharmed. For example, we put on a seatbelt. If we're driving early in the morning or late at night, or anytime I guess it's dark, maybe there's an eclipse, we're going to turn our headlights on. We are going to obey traffic laws. We are going to maintain our vehicle. That would be making sure that the windshield wipers are working, that the tires are inflated properly, and that any other mechanical issues are resolved. We are also going to eliminate distractions, so we're not going to talk on the phone or text while we're driving, and we are also going to avoid any impairments. For example, we're not going to drink multiple alcoholic beverages and then get in the car and drive. And so all of these different things that we do, our seatbelt, our headlights, obeying traffic laws, these are controls. These are things that we do to maintain a safe environment and to hopefully ensure that we are not in a car accident, but if we are in a car accident, that we're mitigating that risk, that bodily harm. Now let's look at a privacy-specific example. And here, our privacy risk is going to be emotional harm, embarrassment, and discrimination. The threat that could cause that risk to materialize would be a breach of protected health information, or PHI. I want you to imagine, for example, that you have medical records, they're in a file, electronic or paper, and those health records reveal that you have what you believe to be a very embarrassing health condition. If that information were to get out, posted online, circulated amongst your colleagues, you would be very embarrassed. You may suffer from paranoia, the fear of discrimination. There may be some emotional harm there. Well, perhaps the individuals that are responsible for handling your medical records, perhaps they're not properly trained. And because they are not properly trained, they do not implement the correct access controls. This may lead to anyone accessing these records. Similarly, if information is being collected that does not need to be collected, and that over-collected personal data is included in your health file, well, when they're accessing the medical records, they're going to access this other data as well that should not have been collected to start with. Improper access controls, as I just mentioned, a lack of transparency. If you, as the data subject, as the patient in this situation, are not aware of the rights that you have, if there is this lack of transparency, then you lack agency over the control of your own information. If this information is kept on a hard drive or on a cloud, and the information, when at rest or in transit, is not encrypted, then it is susceptible to unauthorized access. And finally, if the information systems, the networks that are processing and disseminating your personal data, if those systems have not been designed with privacy by design principles in mind, then there may be a number of other vulnerabilities that are not obvious when this data is collected. And so each of these vulnerabilities, they all have controls. Instead of having untrained staff, we can provide regular privacy training and awareness so that the individuals who handle your and others' data can protect it appropriately. We can institute data minimization, collecting only what's necessary for the business use case. We can implement proper access controls, so only individuals with a need to know are able to access that data. We can perform internal cybersecurity and privacy audits or hire a third party to come in and perform an audit for us. Those audits would hopefully reveal any weaknesses in our systems and help us to improve those systems to correct those weaknesses. We can encrypt data at rest and in transit. And if developing a new system or process by scratch, we can implement privacy by design principles. So again, we have risk equals threat times vulnerability. We identify risks, and then we implement controls to help prevent or mitigate those risks. For the exam, there are 4 types of risk that you need to know about, and these are very broad categories: legal, operational, reputation, and strategic. Legal risk, as you might imagine, deals with any violation of federal, state, local, or international law. A contract that we have with a customer, this could be an individual or it could be another business. This contract and violation of that contract could also pose a legal risk for our organization. Also, with regards to legal, are industry standards, for example, the PCI DSS, which we've discussed. When we're referring to operational risk, this is any risk that would affect our administrative efficiency. For example, if our systems go down, or if there's a ransomware attack that locks up all of our data, then we may not be able to perform any work. That would be an operational hazard. And so what we're looking to do to limit operational risk is strike the right balance for customers and the organization. And I want you to think about a spectrum, and there are 2 points of this spectrum with regards to data collection. So this is our data collection spectrum. On one end, one extreme end of the spectrum, we have the maximization spectrum. And an organization subscribing to this perspective may collect any and all data, even if it is not necessary. So this organization is over-collecting, and perhaps they're over-collecting because, well, just because they can, because it's not necessarily illegal, and they might think of some novel use for that data in the future. On the other end of the spectrum, and again, this is an extreme side of the spectrum, is the minimalist perspective. And the minimalist perspective believes that data is toxic. It does not want to collect any personal data, and if it does, it retains that data for only as long as necessary. And you can see with both of these cases, there are liabilities. In the minimalist case, we're not going to be able to provide any personalization for our customers. And we're also not going to have that type of operational data that's going to allow us to improve our processes or to gather feedback on our products and services. For the maximization perspective, we're creating too much liability because we're collecting too much data. And that repository of data would be a single point of hazard if it were to be attacked by malicious actors. The third type of risk is reputation. And again, I think this is pretty straightforward. I just want you to think for a moment what would happen if your company were targeted by a ransomware attack, or if someone managed to exfiltrate all of your company's data and leak it onto the dark web, and then announce that leak to the entire world. How would your organization be affected by that? Specifically, how would your organization's reputation be affected? Perhaps there are no legal consequences. I think that's unlikely, but let's just say, for example, there are no legal consequences. There are no operational consequences. There are most certainly going to be reputational consequences. And finally, the fourth type of risk is strategic. And with strategic, the IAPP for the CIPM exam is thinking specifically of investment. And so what is the return on investment for a privacy program? And again, if there were to be a large data breach, or if you invest in a tool or service that does not produce the expected results, what type of risk does that pose for the organization? The final concept that I want to go over in this lecture is the 3 lines model. And this is thinking about the first line of defense, the second line of defense, and the third line of defense. So the first line of defense concerns the operational management and staff. These are the folks that are managing risk on a day-to-day basis. The second line of defense is going to be your compliance or privacy function. These are the folks in a lot of organizations that are overseeing and supporting the first or the front line. And finally, the third line of defense is an internal audit function. This internal audit function operates independently of the first two, and in many ways serves as a check on both of these. Again, one of the functions of an audit team is to identify all of the policies, processes, and procedures, to look over the evidence or the artifacts that the privacy program is fulfilling all of its legal, regulatory, and policy requirements, and then using this body of evidence, determine where the gaps are, where are the weaknesses. In this lecture, we did a quick review of risk. Remember that risk is the potential for harm. We then looked at the 4 types of risk that you need to know for the exam. These are legal, organizational, reputation, and strategic. And we concluded with a brief overview of the 3 lines model. This includes the first line, second line, and third line of defense.